Hi there, welcome to the third video in this AGU presentation. So as you may remember, at the end of the previous video, I was discussing how for doing probabilistic seismic hazard analysis in the East African Rift, including fault sources could be really important. Obvious challenges and reasons why this hasn't been done before in terms of the active fault mapping there being generally quite incomplete and there being very few on-fault slip rate measurements at all within the rift. So to address some of these challenges, we've been working in southern Malawi. So we're here at the kind of southern end of the East African Rift western branch, where the rift is amagmatic and it's exposed onshore. And so the first challenge for us was really just to identify and map where active faults in the rift are. So we did this from a combination of looking at high resolution digital elevation models, two field campaigns in 2018 and 2019, looking at legacy geological maps and also some geophysical data sets. And we've compiled this information into what we've called the South Malawi Active Fault Database. And this is containing kind of very objective attributes of these faults, such as their location, their geomorphic attributes, and some kind of confidence that these faults are still active, using this criteria here, where we're basically saying that any fault that shows evidence for activity during East African rifting is still active. So that's up to about mid-Pliocene in this part of the rift. But complementary to the active fault database is this kind of South Malawi Seismogenic source database. And this is where the active faults are now being assigned attributes such as earthquake magnitude, slip rates, and fault recurrence intervals, which are much more subjective and kind of derived from a systems-based approach that we've designed. So in this database, one of the first steps for us was to identify any fault segmentation in Malawi, because this is important because it might suggest that instead of a fault rupturing along their entire length, they might just rupture within smaller sections which are bounded by geometrical complexities in these faults. And in this map here, the blue triangles are showing places along the fault where there's some kind of geometrical complexity in the fault's trace, which might be a barrier to future earthquake ruptures. But also, quite interestingly, in Malawi, when you look at the along strike scarp height of these faults, you notice that there are some minima which are not associated with any obvious fault geometrical complexities. And so this is suggesting to us that there may be some kind of deeper structures that we can't see in the fault surface expression, but are also going to be potentially important in controlling rupture segmentation in the rift. And so this information is also incorporated into the Seismogenic source database. So as I said before, there's really very little data out there in terms of the slip rates or recurrence intervals of these faults. So we've taken a slightly different approach in Malawi, where because it's an amagmatic continental rift and the distribution of strain between the rift's bounding faults and the kind of intrabasin faults is quite well constrained from other studies in the East African Rift. But we can maybe use this as a way of partitioning the regional extensional strain that's measured in the rift from geodesy to get an idea of the slip rates. And that's kind of encapsulated in this equation here, where the slip rate for each fault is calculated in terms of this weighting factor, in terms of how we think the extensional strain is distributed between border faults and intrabasin faults, the rift extension rate from geodesy, and the strike of the fault and its dip. And obviously there's some uncertainty with this, which we've explored with a logic tree. And then from these slip rates, if we have an idea of how much these faults slip in an earthquake, which we're going to estimate using the Leonard 2010 equations between fault length and single event displacement, then we can get an idea of a recurrence interval. And again, because we think these faults tend to be segmented in Malawi, we're doing these calculations for a rupture that considers the whole fault rupturing or the fault just rupturing in these smaller individual sections. So these plots here are kind of showing the results of doing these calculations for faults in Malawi. So as you'd expect, you've got the highest slip rates on those border faults, which we tend to think localize extensional strain within continental rifts, about 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters per year, whereas the intrabasin faults tend to be around about 0.05 to 0.1 millimeters per year, and that's obviously then going to carry on in terms of their recurrence interval estimates. They're much larger for these intrabasin faults. But as you can see from the error bars, there is some quite large uncertainty on this, and this is still an area that we're investigating and seeing if we can maybe reduce the size of these error bars. But essentially what the Seismogenic source database is kind of conveying to us is that there's likely quite infrequent but potentially quite large magnitude earthquakes in Malawi. I mean, some of these faults are up to 100 kilometers or longer, which, scientifically is very interesting, but from a societal point of view, is really quite important. This is a map here of fault slip rates underlain by distribution of Malawi's population. And you can see this is quite a densely populated part of Malawi. There's about 7.75 million people living in this part of the rift. So it's really important that we can convert the data in the Seismogenic source database into probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, so we can actually have an idea about what kind of hazard this population is facing, and we'll discuss that in the next video. For those of you who are interested in how we've developed these databases, it's fully explained in this manuscript here, which is in open review in Solid Earth, and there's a link to it in the poster.